نحضر مع بعض.
دنيا بصي للعمو.
I think, Lina, they're asking me to start.
Okay, great. Shall I? Okay. Good morning. Welcome to our panel today. No? Okay. Good morning. Welcome everyone to our panel. And today we're going to talk about Me Too and its resonance in the Arab world, and we're going to focus on Egypt because Egypt is the country that tops the world's list when it comes to sexual harassment. We're going to focus on sexual harassment in the newsroom, and we're going to go beyond the idea because everyone knows that, when you go to do an interview in Egypt, or whether you're just graduated or you're interning in a newspaper or you are actual staff, you're prone to everything from sexual harassment inside the newsroom, from bosses asking for sexual favors or using inappropriate language or anything, to trying to interview a source that does not look you in the eye but looks in your chest or your thighs or whatever. And it goes, and I mean, you all know what happens, and it goes into threats about your personal life and your personal relationship, and the stories are repetitive everywhere in the world. The only thing is that it's still a taboo in Egypt, and it's still, when you talk about it, it backlashes against you. You're threatened of being fired, or you are actually fired, like our friend and colleague Maya El Shemi, who couldn't be here today because she was denied visa, because she was fired from her job, and because she complained, and she filed a case against her boss for sexually harassing her, and he filed a case against her and fired her from her job. Her case was dismissed. His case is still ongoing in court, but she can't travel. She can't be here with us today. So a big shout to Maya El Shemi from here, and to everyone who still fights and resists and continues to work under these conditions. I'm going to start introducing my panelists. I have Donia Kamal here, a writer and a journalist. I have Lina Attalah, the founder of Mada Masr, and I have Fatemah Farag, director of One Ifra, Women in News Middle East, and director of Welad Elbalad. I'm going to start with Donia. We're going to talk a little bit about personal experience in the newsroom in an American network in the Arab world.
Welcome, everyone. I have a long experience in working in the newsroom for almost the last 15 years. My last experience was in an American network in the Gulf area. I have actually all the girls, all the female journalists in the newsroom experienced different forms of sexual harassment. And the main problem was everyone refusing to define if the encounters that happened with the female journalists was actually sexual harassment or not. So, for example, we had one of our colleagues, a reporter, an Egyptian reporter, who was engaged in a different conversation about his sexual life individually with each and every female journalist in the newsroom, and no one talked about this, and no one actually exchanged experience in this. And when I left the network, I was asked to write an article about sexual harassment in the newsroom, and I referred to this incident along with many other ones, and I got like more than 12 phone calls from my colleagues saying, "Oh, this happened with you as well. We faced the same thing." The problem is taking legal action against sexual harassment that happens in this way is almost impossible when it comes to the Arab world, because I approached a couple of lawyers because of one of my colleagues who used to take pictures of all the girls holding his mobile phone and taking photos of the girls in skirts or in dresses, and everyone knew about it, even the security of the building, and no one actually wanted to acknowledge that this happened. And when I approached the legal department in the American International Network, they said, we have nothing to do against this, you have to deal with it yourself. And the lawyer said this is something that we cannot prove, and it's subject to points of view, so we have nothing to do to you. So I think that almost all female journalists are subject to this kind of harassments, and we have to go into very long debates about, is this actually sexual harassment? I didn't touch you, I didn't grab your part of your body to call it sexual harassment, but engaging in a sexual conversation, inappropriate conversations, or taking pictures of your colleagues without their consent, and I don't know actually what he does with these pictures, but all these, I think there are forms of different sexual harassments which nobody is taking action against it, so that's my personal experience, part of it.
Okay, so legal action, I don't know a single case that actually went to court and it won. I mean, all cases get dismissed, even though the penal code in Egypt actually defines what a sexual harassment is, and it's a felony. I mean, you can go to jail from 6 months till 3 years if you just say to your colleague, oh, you look beautiful today. But why is legal action not taking? And why are there no sexual harassment policies in our newsrooms? Lina Attalah, you're the only one who has a sexual harassment policy in your newsroom, right?
I don't know. I think Fatemah would know better, but I think it's a direction that many more people are starting to take. Because our story was developing or drafting a policy for sexual harassment. Is that we started off 6 years ago thinking that we don't need that kind of policy because we are a progressive space, and then things happened in Egypt, such as, you know, a famous case of a famous progressive politician being accused by someone of sexually harassing her, alongside another also human rights defender being similarly accused of actually rape, and you know, stories continued to roll out, and you know, we were put in this situation of there is no reason why a progressive space won't have a policy against sexual harassment. And not only that, it's really problematic that we spend 4 years of our existence without having a sexual harassment policy. So we went on developing it. We were helped a great deal by the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, which is the other organization that is not news, but more a human rights organization that made a long shot in drafting the policy. So we created some working group where we fed off of each other, but we also adapted the policy to the peculiar specificities of our field, us being essentially a news organization. I don't need to go into great depth into the content of the policy. Very happy to share it. We were actually thinking of publishing it also because it's the kind of policy that does not concern only our staff members, but also people from who, you know, obviously work with us as contributors, as freelancers. Spaces that are defined in this policy are not restricted to the workspace, as in the office space. Workspaces include spaces where we do events, spaces where our journalists go to do interviews. So there is quite an open and wide definition of spaces where an incident of sexual harassment or sexual assault occurs. There is also quite a progressive definition of what constitutes consent, also the question of temporality that is associated with consent. So consent at which point is an important question and part of this policy. The policy, I don't know why it does this. The policy also gives access, can be used by, is a tool that can be used by survivors who are not only members of Mada or like members of Mada staff. It can be anyone really who attended a Mada party or attended a Mada event or worked with an editor in Mada, so it's a tool not restricted to the use of the community, the close community of Mada, as in the Mada staff. And the policy gives a different set of tools for people, for survivors of sexual assault, that start anywhere from, as per the request, starts anywhere from mediation all the way to filing an official complaint and holding a formal investigation. It is naturally, as it claims to be a progressive policy, survivor-centered. So any act or any step has to be taken with the full consent of, and upon basically the request of the survivor. And repercussions can go anywhere from, a suspension, temporary suspension, all the way to full-on firing if the person is a full-time member of the organization. We try, alongside the disciplinary measures, to have a bit of a reparative approach, which is very, very difficult. I mean, the reason why we don't relegate these cases to the criminal justice system is that it's a system that we spend so much critiquing in our journalism, and we feel that we need to have a bit of a different approach, in the sense that as much as it is a felony and it's a crime, are we looking to create a Puritan space that doesn't have any offenders, or can we at least try to deploy a sense of self-reflection in the process at all? It's not easy, but we have the sensibility, and we're trying to get training, especially for the complaints committee that is tasked with receiving any notices of sexual harassment from the team, to think in their approach how it can have a bit of a reparative sensibility. The last thing I'll say, not to take too much of your time, is that our policy has two main principles. First, it encourages people to use it. It encourages people to resort to the tools and not to be silent. And by encouraging, I mean that it has all sorts of protection measures in terms of confidentiality. So there are actually there could be actually disciplinary measures against breaches of confidentiality from any party involved in an investigation, for example. So on one hand, it has this this encouragement nature, but it also has a preventative principle, in the sense of how can we make the workspace in general less likely to be a space where such incidents occur. And for that, we've been organizing many psychoeducational sessions centered around the question of power dynamics, basically rendering our colleagues aware of how power is essentially hidden, a lot of the times invisible, and a lot of the times quite structural. So when we're talking about gender dynamics and the power that intersects with them, we need to understand that better and think about it in our day-to-day practices as individuals, and that's what we do in those psychoeducation sessions. We also try to not be super heteronormative in the applications of this policy, which is a very common tendency for, I don't know, I would say understandable reasons, but there is no reason to be this way if you have the sensibility of not being heteronormative. And yeah, that's, I guess, in a nutshell. So.
What you're saying is very, very important, encouraging and creating a safe space for women and men to work together. Because on the other hand, we hear, we have statements from, from big shots in the media saying the complete other opposite. Like, when the Me Too hashtag spread in the Arab world, we have statements and tweets from people saying, it's already difficult hiring women in the newsroom because, in a few months they get married, then they have children, then they stay at home and take 3 months of paid leave. But now they are also complaining and making a fuss about sexual harassment that makes it really impossible for us to hire them, and it makes us think twice. And these were public statements made, and no one stood up for it. So, so what you're saying, or what you're trying to create at Mada, is actually very, very progressive, and that's exactly what we need. Fatemah, you're trying to do something similar. You have a handbook and a module and training, right?
It's working? All right. So Women in News is a program that's been ongoing now in the Middle East for 3 years. And when we first started out, we found that the women who are usually mid to senior level within their newsrooms were coming into the program, that the issue of sexual harassment would come up within the newsroom with their sources as a part of daily work. This was something that they confronted, and not just in Egypt, but also in other parts of the Arab world. At the same time, the program also does advocacy work with senior executives within the industry, and whenever we would bring up the topic of sexual harassment within these closed circles, we would be faced with these wide-eyed, sort of looks of, what are you talking about? And this disconnect really between what was happening on the ground in newsrooms and the reality of women's work and what senior executives and decision makers were perceiving the reality to be was definitely there, whether this was intentional because they are part of the problem or whether it was just because they are not interested in the issue. You get both variations. But the point was that there was a lack of consensus and understanding within newsrooms that this needs to be identified, that it needs to be talked about openly, and that it needs to be handled. So we moved into setting up a handbook, and the handbook is meant to answer a lot of the questions and issues that were brought up by both the women and the executives that we were dealing with. How do we identify it? And even, a lot of women journalists come up with this question: is this sexual harassment or not? This comes up a lot. So trying to answer that, trying to reach an understanding as to what constitutes sexual harassment, what are your rights when this happens, how to handle it, how do you create as a manager, whether a man or woman manager, how do you create a safe space for this to be brought up, and then how do you manage it once it has been brought up? And how do we sensitize everyone within the newsroom to an understanding and a zero tolerance policy? So this is what the handbook does, and it's available now in Arabic and English and has been disseminated within our partner network. But then we also decided that we needed to take this a step further because people will look at a handbook and maybe they'll look at it or not, read it or not, deal with it or not. So to take this into sort of a more proactive space, we also set up a training module that was based on the handbook. And this, we work with organizations one-on-one, and we implement the training, and the training is given not just to the women, but to men and women working together. And as much as possible, we try and bring in senior executives into the training. And we've done this also by connecting this training to other trainings that people are interested in, like strategic planning or mojo skills and what have you, and make it a package. So if you're going to get this, then you have to take this. And so putting those together and making it something that people really have to take. It's not by choice. And getting people into the room and discussing this. So this is the phase that we're at now, implementing this. We should be done by the end of this year, having implemented to all partner organizations the training. And then the next phase, as we see the demand coming up from within newsrooms, is to work with policymakers within organizations and HR departments on how do we translate this into the bylaws and the job policies of the organizations themselves. How do you own it? How does this become the policy of X organization, not WAN IFRA's Women in News training module? So that is the next phase that we're going to be working on. And I think key here is answering, the questions that are coming up from the ground from everyone and bringing everyone into the same room. So the journalists, the decision makers, the men and the women, getting everyone to sit and face each other and agree. With an end game being, we need to have newsrooms and workspaces that are respectful of everyone, are safe for everyone, and that's in the benefit of everyone who's involved in this profession.
Okay, I'm going to ask you here, have you faced any resistance? Obviously, this is something new, but have you faced resistance when you were trying to suggest it?
Oh, yeah. You face resistance, and it's interesting, you face it from men and women, because it's if you're an ambitious professional, you don't really want to have this necessarily, you don't want to necessarily deal with this. It's very murky territory, and it has ramifications. Related to your promotion, to your standing, to your social standing, to your standing with your family, with your prospects. So you'll find that there's resistance from a lot of women that in a closed room, what will be said is different from what you'd be willing to sit here and say, what you'd be because of these ramifications. And sometimes I think that women professionals like to distance themselves from this because they want to be dealt with as professionals, not as women. And so they're also trying to create this distinction between both, and sometimes that creates, I think, that reflective action that you don't want to have to deal with it. So there's a resistance there, and of course there's a resistance from the male executives who, you get this so often, insistence that no, this doesn't happen here. It's just like that's it. I don't want to hear anything else about this, because to accept that it does happen here opens up a big can of worms, and we understand this. And I think that sometimes it's not that they themselves even engage in it, but they just don't want to have to open up the can of worms that relates to everyone else that's engaging with it. And then once you start with the newsroom, then you need to start talking about your sources, and that really gets you into murky territory when you think about who those sources mostly are and the way journalism operates within MENA, and that connects you into a whole other thing about how the profession is constructed and its relationship to authority and how people come into the positions that they're in. So there's that, and then of course you get resistance based on the grounds of we are media organizations that are facing crisis, financial crisis, political crisis, issues of polarization. The whole region is in crisis. Really, why do I have to take time now and discuss this? This is the least of my problems. You also get that business argument, and we've come back with arguments that show that when you implement policies that support women and safety in the newsroom and gender diversity and diversity in general within your newsroom, this is actually good for business. So we've done a lot of work on developing the business argument to counter that. Even if you are an organization that's in financial crisis, this is something you should be dealing with now for these reasons. So also coming back with answers to that.
Great. So resistance and have you faced resistance being in the most progressive sphere?
The problem come in the details, because again, when we first gathered everyone in our annual retreat 2 years ago, and we said we need to be working on an anti-sexual harassment policy, everyone was like, do we need that kind of policy? And then up until we finalized the full draft a year later, we started going through all these sessions of psychoeducation, of thinking power dynamics, gendered power dynamics, and this is where people started realizing that a lot of the things that they take for granted can be actually problematic, and that it's a good thing to have this tool. I think the resistance it's not really resistance, but up until we reached the last draft, we also had to workshop the policy a few times with our team, and there were some contentions. There were some contentions about the severity of the disciplinary measure at some points. There were some concerns about, there was a very valid concern about, how to encourage survivors to, file a complaint, because a lot of the times there is a concern that even though the policy is heavily survivor-centered, and even though the policy commits to training the committee, because at the end of the day, it's not a committee that has been necessarily trained on running investigations, they are journalists. The committee is basically elected from within the team, so we do every year an election of the committee, and then every year a new committee takes over. So even though the policy trains the committee, commits to training it properly, is survivor-centered, there's always a concern of what would be the repercussions for me as a survivor to file a complaint and do this. Even if, we go through the motions of running the investigations, proving the offender or the respondent to be, proving the accusations against the respondent, and eventually, firing them, how do I face the informal dynamics in the workspace after this happens? So it's not really, I wouldn't call it resistance, there have been concerns. And we agreed that really, this is the kind of thing that we need to practice and learn from practicing it in order to see what kind of tweaks that need to happen. And in fact, I think 2 years on, Now, we already are ready to adapt certain tweaks from some of the experiences we've been having from all these workshops and the cases and all of that, such as, for example, revisiting some of the rights of the respondents and some of the rights of the complainants. So I'm just saying that, and we've been talking about this with Fatemah, life is complicated and it's so easy to be righteous about these things, but when it comes to really dealing with cases, it becomes more complicated because there isn't, an absolute sort of notion of justice that is shared across the board with everyone. So I guess practicing and continuing the conversation is very important, and the collectivity aspect of it is very important because at the end of the day, it's not the institution's management is in this learning process as much as everyone else. So nobody can sort of, it can't, like these kinds of policies in particular, they can't be the kind of thing where the management assumes the full responsibility of the drafting and of basically ruling how justice should look like. The last thing I'll say is that I am really struggling with the question of community justice and reparative approaches. And I'm struggling with the idea of how do we deal with harassers in the sense of, beyond making sure that they are out of our spaces, are we fine with them going and doing that thing elsewhere? How do we really try to cultivate a culture of self-reflection or reintegration even? These are the questions I struggle with a lot, so.
I think with the Me Too movement and the similar hashtags that we have in the Arab world, there was a huge solidarity campaign from men and women and there was actually a good reception for those. Like there were people who came out and said, "We did this. We're sorry. We didn't know it was that hurtful." So there was this, there was a huge open dialogue between people. Yes, of course, there are those people who attack the Me Too movement and say, you're paid by, why are you bringing this up now? You must be terrorists. Why are you bringing this up now? You must be against building Egypt. Of course, there is this discourse, but there was also another discourse from people trying to understand what is sexual harassment, what is accepted, what is not accepted, and there was a huge and productive discussion which we did not have 10 or 20 years ago, and we're having now. We are lagging behind, but I think we're gonna catch up. Donia had a completely different experience when trying to, implement justice, to stand up for yourself, to, refuse being victimized.
My own experience was that I was threatened by the organization which I used to work for. They sent threats through my colleagues. They sent me threats directly, and they wanted to move a lawsuit against me, which was actually funny because I never mentioned their name. I never mentioned anyone who worked in that organization. I didn't mention even the city which I was working in. So obviously, they knew that it was them. I tried a lot to take this legally and to. As a person, I don't really believe in social shaming or in this kind of social bashing of people, because the backlashes here they might be really ugly. So I was really looking for something legal that I should be doing, and the procedures were a lot. I've never worked in a platform which implements initiatives like the ones which Lina and Fatemah were talking about, and I'm very proud that they're doing this. But still, I think there is a very long way that we should be going through, even with the Me Too campaign, even with the open dialogue that Lina was talking about. I have a lot of colleagues who were subject to sexual harassment from people who actually received a training and received this kind of modules, and they thought, even though they think it's unnecessary, but it's a very long way. It's essential that there is there'll be like millions of initiatives like this, a lot of trainings for both men and women, because women are still afraid to speak about this, and when you try to stir it up and try to, we know, I mean, we work in the same workplace. We know you've been subject to this exactly like me. Maybe maybe we're in an even worse situation. And when you try to convince a colleague to speak up and to stand in solidarity with the rest of their colleagues, they will always resist this because of so many reasons, which I think all the women here in the room knows about. So I think people should be more encouraged to know about their legal status when it comes to this. I know the laws are not enforced, or they're not implemented enough in the Arab world, and even in the rest of the world still it's a very complicated process. So speaking up, standing in solidarity, I think these are the two main things. Defining what is sexual harassment is. It's anything that comes without consent. Anything. I mean, a word, a move, a conversation. This is something that obviously a lot of people are unaware of, men and women both. So a lot of the initiatives which they are talking about is essential for this. A lot of legal procedures should be more spoken of. It should be more investigated. It should be more discussed in our countries. Until now, I think this is still in a very weak state, but I hope in the future things would be better. But to start with, I mean, the Me Too is an amazing start for this, especially in our countries, and still we need more and more, like, even with all the resistance that comes with the, you're not progressive enough, you're not open-minded enough, you're a journalist, you should be accepting this kind of casual conversation from a colleague or casual touch from a colleague, which is still, no, I shouldn't. If I do not like it, this is unacceptable, but you get accused of everything, and it always ends up with you, the person who is not, I mean, you did the mistake, you're the person who's wronged. So I think the initiatives are important, the legal discussions are important, the social media campaigns are very, very important, of course, with a lot of caution when it comes to, I mean, there are a lot of people waiting for any uncalculated word that might raise legal action against everyone. So I think this is very important for us to be doing.
Yeah, definitely standing up and and speaking up is very, very important. The backlash that happens against all the women who spoke up, especially against some of the liberal or well-known faces in the media or human rights field were attacked, and that makes it less likely that people would speak again. But I guess, I mean, speaking up, there is no other way. There is no other way than saying no and speaking up. And
let me just add something here. Still, with the Me Too campaign, with the trainings, with everything that we have right now, we still have very, very famous and established, wide world acknowledged and well-known journalists who stand as an icon and as a figure, who wouldn't mind at all harassing their colleagues in open spaces and in closed spaces, and they don't actually care if this would put them in trouble, and they don't acknowledge that this might get them in trouble. There is still this sense of entitlement that comes from people who think that they are beyond any kind of legal action or punishment of any kind. So I think we all have a lot of experiences.
Yeah, because they think they can get away with it, and that they're, being famous and celebrated gives them immunity. And also, I mean, it's very difficult for some men, especially our bosses, to accept that. That when we say no, we actually mean no. It doesn't mean that I'm not open-minded, and it doesn't mean that I'm weak or that I don't know what to say. It means that it's a no because I don't like you, maybe, because I don't want this, because I'm a professional, for so many reasons. However, I want to open the floor for some questions, okay, Wafi.
My name is Wafa Heikel. I'm an Egyptian journalist, and I want to focus a little bit on online spaces because we were talking about how to protect our spaces, the newsrooms that we are living in, but the Me Too movement started with an online spaces. All the conversation happened in Egypt, and for the last couple of years, we're going through the social media. And I want to go through how we can Like the danger, there is no danger in having this conversation online, but it's still problematic. And it also triggers some attacks. And I want to talk also about the attacks against female journalists who do quality journalism online by like hate speech based on gender and sexually harass them. And if there is something in your policies, in your newsroom or handbooks that covers this on online spaces, how can tech companies help like do collective investigations or tools to report harassment in workspaces?
Can we take another question? Okay.
Thank you. I'm glad we are having this conversation because sexual harassment is a worldwide issue, from London to Cairo to other cities. And I'm originally from Tunisia, and recently in Tunisia we have adopted a law to criminalize sexual harassment, and that came with a lot of jokes from men asking, can we go to jail if we like make a compliment to a woman? What is like acceptable, not acceptable? And the newsroom is echo what happened in the street often, and men are the same either in the newsroom or in our neighborhood. And I just want to reflect on the work of civil societies. So many local organizations have campaigned about it. They've launched like a campaign to explain what is harassment, what a woman want her messages, and they have set like hotline or forms that women can make complaint. And I just was wondering if there are any collaboration between like local media in Egypt with civil societies, so that they can, like, for example, reach out to an organization anonymously and make a case, or kind of network that exists, so that like a woman can have the network or support from civil societies working with a newsroom, for example.
Okay. More questions? Okay.
Hi. Thanks. Sorry. This is a little bit more of maybe a theoretical question. I note that most of the audience here are women, but thank you, man, for coming too, the three of you.
4 or 5.
Gender is constructed. So to a certain extent, there's a narrative that's been constructed around a binary definition, right? Women, men, men present, women absent, men father, women mother. The political sphere is a male one. The domestic one is a woman one. The production of knowledge is a male one. The production of people is a woman one. The mind, the body, etc. So all these kind of binaries. So we're talking about what happens in a newsroom. We're talking to loads of women here. Surely one of our jobs, and this is maybe not part of the culture of a newsroom necessarily, but I think it's probably a question about that you're maybe touching on, Lina, on reparations, because what you're doing there when you talk about the struggle you've got with the notion of reparation, or the notion of excluding people, I think you're touching on this notion that actually gender is constructed. We are all part of a patriarchal system. So it's not just women, but men that are absolutely part of this system that's been constructed from a system that's economic. It's an economic system that is drawn on these binaries in order to generate profit, really. We're talking about capitalism. So this is a roundabout way of saying, how do we deconstruct patriarchy beyond this notion of Me Too that draws 95% women to a meeting? Thank you.
Okay. One last question, but yes.
Hi. So in your work, you're developing guidelines to combat sexual harassment that are specific to Egypt or to the Middle East, in the case of Wanifra. I was wondering, did you find yourself having to respond to certain specificities of workplaces in the Middle East, or did you find that guidelines that were developed in Western news companies are applicable no matter what? And if so, which ones are the specificities? Thank you.
take some answers first before we forget. Fatemah, you wanna get the question of online space?
Why don't I start with?
Are you working on that?
One on the
okay.
On the how do you develop the manual? It answers. We also work in Africa. The program does work in Africa and in Southeast Asia. So there is, the overriding that combines between all three areas. That is informed by work that has been done in other parts of the world within the media industry. But these regional editions also attempt to address what we know come up as recurrent questions. Sometimes they are similar and sometimes they aren't, but more often than not they are similar. And we're finding that the overriding concern relates to the business argument, and this is one where we've done a lot of work. So local editions or regional editions, somewhat specific, but there is a lot of similarity. And because there's a lot of similarity also between the experiences of women journalists in Africa, in MENA, in Southeast Asia, and other parts of the world. So we're also trying to create that unity as well in the work that's done. So I think that might answer your question. I wanted to also comment on this issue and about how we reflect what's happening in society. And it made me think of a conversation I had with a woman journalist who works in one of our newsrooms at my company. And she was like, you have no idea what it's like. And here, of course, not all women are equal, and class plays a big part in, I think, how women experience this. What it's like for me to have to think about what I'm wearing, to have to go out onto the street and think how men are looking at me, to get onto public transportation and worry about who's sitting next to me, and then get off and walk to the office. By the time I get to the office, I cannot stand myself. And so that whole experience that she's having on the street in her daily life, because there is a prevalence of harassment and of dealing with women in a certain way, you can create a safe space at work, and we must strive to do so. But, it will only be as effective, I think, as we're able to also affect what's happening in society and to sort of interact with other stakeholders who are trying to do that and creating, societies which stop treating women in this way and deconstructing patriarchy around how we act and how we behave and how we live. So just to comment on that.
Just to pick up from there and address a bit Marcella's question. Thank you for bringing Judith Butler to the conversation. It's very important, I think. I think two things that we put into consideration when we think of questions of sexual violence. For example, when we started applying or drafting actually the anti-sexual harassment policy, in parallel to it, we actually started drafting also an anti-bullying policy. Because as much as, of course, there is a hype around sexual violence, violence and power can be committed in different ways, particularly against notions of class, race, which is less relevant to our newsroom, but definitely class is a major question there. So the idea is to not exceptionalize power to gender constructions, established gender constructions, but to think about it in an intersectional way. And that's the second thing. We are quite influenced by second and third wave feminism in the sense of we understand gender in an intersectional way. So we don't only think about it or write about it in our coverage or develop policies for it with the thinking of women's rights alone, but also with questions of what does it mean if you're a woman from outside of Cairo, for example, and collaborating with this newsroom, or if you are from from a different class background. How does this affect the power dynamics? And this is something that we try to be attentive to, and that's also, for me, a way to also disrupt these boundaries and to think about the complexity of these constructions a bit more. So that's one thing to take into consideration. In terms of online spaces, we do not tend to exceptionalize online spaces when it comes to gender-based violence in terms of thinking of protection mechanisms. I think being online by now is not only an extension of everyday life and everyday practices, it's actually part and parcel of how we live life. So it goes without saying, for example, if we have an investigation that, online records are heavily used as evidence, for example, in a case. So we don't have particular tools to address online spaces just because, everyday life includes both being online and offline. What applies here applies there, and to some extent. But I'd be happy to learn if there are particular tools putting into consideration that I'm a bit skeptical to discourses that exceptionalize the online spaces in terms of, the desire to protect women there and so on. So.
Okay. There are more questions? Okay, we take more questions, sure. Okay, sure.
Hello. Thank you so much. I missed a little in the beginning, so sorry. I hope I don't ask anything about what you said in the begining. My name's Andalusia, and I live in Mexico, and we just had Me Too just took off 2 weeks ago in Mexico, and it has been a nightmare of with hundreds of journalists and writers and academics all being called out online, and then a very prominent musician published a suicide note because he had been denounced for pedophilia, and he committed suicide. And then that caused an enormous backlash with everyone saying that it's because of Me Too that he committed suicide. And he didn't say in his letter, but he did hashtag Me Too when he said that I need to leave this world because I've been accused of this. And then a result is that there now is that Me Too hombres, or like Me Too men, and they have opened an account for people to now denounce, when they've been harassed by women, even though the original Me Too accounts did actually accept harassment that was, if it was committed by a woman. But I guess my question, and sadly now the Me Too hombres account has, I think, more followers than any of the other Me Too accounts. And it's like when you start reading it, your blood starts boiling. So it's like I followed and literally unfollowed 2 seconds later. I was like, no, I cannot read this. But I just wonder what what recommendations you have for what to do when the dialogue is very, what's the word? It's very toxic. There's a lot of very toxic dialogue that is out there. So what do you, the natural, I think, reaction is often to ignore it because you don't want to play into their games, but they are gaining territory, a lot of territory, and the online discussion. And when I went to follow the account, I saw how many people I follow, and mostly male journalists that are probably like, these stupid feminists, look, we got our own account now. So I don't know, any recommendations you have of how to engage with this toxic backlash?
So I was struck by something, Donia, that you said that, any unwanted word, anything that comes without consent is harassment. And I guess I want to question whether if we take that perspective, we make it difficult to deal with, the various different levels and intensities of harassment and threats. And is it realistic to think that we can live in spaces that are completely safe when, as journalists, we are regularly taking on risk to be journalists? So I just wanted to push back a little bit and hear more from you on that.
Any more questions? No, we're fine. Okay. I want to say something beforehand. It's this toxic dialogue. I think this is a necessary phase because there was a lot of silence, and the backlash is what we have to deal with for coming out. But ideally, this has to be inclusive. This cannot move forward without men and women coming together into a clear definition and understanding of what is accepted, what is not accepted, and definitely, anything. Basically sometimes we say the same thing, but we end up, getting in an unnecessary clash. So a lot of the men who are like, we don't want to talk about this with you because you're a feminist. And then when you start discussing with them, they say, you're right. You shouldn't, this is not consent. So the basic things that, when when you ask a question, I have the right to say yes or no. It doesn't make you my enemy. It doesn't make you a bad person, but I have the right to say no, as long as I have the right to say yes. So it should be simple, but I think this game and power game, and it's a phase, but after this, I hope there will be an open dialogue with everyone to move forward with this. What do you think, Donia?
I totally feel you, because the minute I wrote that the article was published about, it was a personal experience, opinion article. It didn't have any facts or any, I didn't state any facts. And I had a lot of men like, why aren't you talking about men getting sexually harassed? I was like, okay, you know the blood boiling part? Yes, that was there. I was completely there. And I mean, there's no comparison at all between the number and the percentage of men who get sexually harassed from women compared to the women who get sexually harassed from men, and the amount of risk and how people defend themselves differently when men and women. So I completely feel you. I sometimes engage myself in conversations when I feel that the person in front of me might be able to listen, but mostly I ignore, because you don't need more pressures, right? Because it's too obvious. It's too clear. It needs the minimum basic common sense to know what is sexual harassment, to know that it's not the same thing. It is not an equal case between men and women here. And this is like I've been going through history long years ago. So I completely feel you with this. As for Courtney, I know I'm a bit extreme when I said that anything that comes without consent, personally, I would consider it sexual harassment, because I have been through all the process of no is a no. Please, as a source, you are not allowed to give me sexual compliments. As my manager, you are not allowed to ask me to give sexual favors to a source to get more information from that. Like all the way. I mean, so it was. I was in a place which is like, no. I mean, if you're telling me about your sexual relationship with your wife in a newsroom while you are my colleague, this is sexual harassment. If you're taking pictures without consent, this is. I mean, this is how I see it. But I know it's extreme, because the case is extreme, because everything from the other side is extreme. I don't want to go into a place where I'm demonizing men, because this will not get us anywhere. But the case is really, really bad, and it goes beyond training, it goes beyond legal action, it goes beyond people who are very aware, they're very smart, they're intellectuals, they're journalists, they're editorial managers, and still they exercise this kind of pressure on you. So we have to draw the limits really in a very extreme position to try to protect ourselves. But I acknowledge that this is an extreme case, and when I say it, I get a lot of attacks from both men and women. I say, yeah, in my experience, I've had all kinds of attacks, I'll call it, from my seniors, from the sources, from my colleagues, from a lot of in different levels, in different cases. So I had to draw the line that way, and it doesn't help. I mean, it helps me protecting myself. And especially when I spoke up and I started putting things into public spaces, so I think I became a little bit of a threat. And I remember a colleague telling me, "Why didn't you write this a couple of years ago?" I mean, everybody now is very polite in the newsroom. This was after I left my work, and everybody is extremely polite in the newsroom, and all the people are like, "Oh, I'm sorry, am I sexually harassing you? Good morning, are you offended?" So yeah, I'd rather have this than having people talking about things that are completely inappropriate.
Yeah, I agree, bravo, Donia. Lina, do you want to address any of the questions? No? Fatemah?
I'll just say that Me Too perhaps has been slow in putting into place procedures and change, structural change. And this may be a part of what you're seeing here, and then when it strikes again someplace else, men look at it and they see what's coming, and so they start hitting back now. So there's that learning curve as well. It's interesting. But I think that's a frustration of the movement. I think it's one that we really need to move beyond and start seeing some real changes on the ground happening. And that I think for those changes to happen in a way that is meaningful and sustainable, this configuration of this room really needs to be different. And I remember when this was first breaking, and I was involved in the organization of events that were dealing with gender and Me Too. that there was actually an intentional move by organizers to only have women. And this is a big, international event, so like this is going to be closed to men. And I know men would come up to the door and feel insulted that they were turned away because they wanted to come in on the conversation. And I think that the women that were inside and sort of sharing all this were losing out on the opportunity to actually make a change. So you saw a lot of that happening, and I think that was sort of an issue. Oh, we have this space, we need to create safe space for women to share. We're beyond this now, and I think we're moving too slowly to actually, this is a space that has to be men and women making real changes to the way we work and live, and that can only happen if we move in that direction. So.
And the last thing I'll say, and it's quite tangential to the question you raised about the Me Too, as much as I think there's a lot of triumphalism around, the power of telling that came out with the proliferation of Me Too campaigns everywhere. And for me, there's a moment of truth in seeing all these accounts in Arabic on social media. I think this has also to take account of the fact that not all difficult emotions can be written into words, and that as much as Me Too is a revolution of telling, it also masks a lot of untelling that is not simply possible within the confines of language. So I always tend to think of that with all the celebration around Me Too, and how it can resolve and raise awareness and so on. So.
I wanna conclude by saying that this conversation is just in the beginning, and it's going to go much further, and we have a long way, but we've started, and if we have started this, if we've started coming out in our 30s, the next generation, like my colleagues in the newsroom are in their 20s, and they have zero tolerance towards sexual harassment, and I imagine my kids, a big shout to my daughters, Hannah and Layla, who are only 5 and 7, but I do not, it's 2019, and we're having this, it's really a shame, but I think my kids will not have this conversation, we'll have a much more progressive conversation, and by the time they grow up, we will have a safer space for both men and women, and this is by no mean an exclusion of men or a battle between men and women or anything. It's an inclusive conversation to all have a safe space to work at. So please join me in thanking my panel, Fatemah Farag, Lina Attalah, Donia Kamal. Thank you very much for attending this.